March 27, 2023, the quiet streets of Little Rock, Arkansas, carried no sign of the tragedy about to unfold. At exactly 4 p.m., a desperate 911 call came through. The voice on the other end never finished their sentence. Silence. Minutes later, officers arrived at a home on Fairley Drive. What they found inside would send shockwaves through the community. Lying on the floor, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds, was 36-year-old Edwina Martin. Paramedics fought to keep her alive as they rushed her to the hospital, but the damage was done. Whatever happened inside that house had been swift, brutal, and deeply personal. As investigators combed through the crime scene, a name kept coming up. A name that had been connected to Edwina's life for more than a decade. A name that should have been the first and only suspect. And yet, this wasn't the first time someone had tried to kill her. 11 years earlier, another attack had left her fighting for her life, but that time, someone else had died. The deeper investigators looked, the more questions arose. How did a woman who had once survived a violent ambush end up in the same deadly situation more than a decade later? Why had she made a choice that no one could understand? And why was the person accused of trying to kill her years earlier now the man she called her husband? As the truth unraveled, it became clear this was not just another crime. It was the final chapter of a story that had been written in blood long before that fateful night in March. For investigators, the name Edwina Martin wasn't just another victim in a crime report. It was a name they had seen before, a name that carried a violent history. But before we get to that, let's go back to the night of March 27, 2023. It was just after 4 p.m. when the first 911 call came in. A neighbor, startled by the sharp sound of gunfire, looked out their window and saw something unsettling. A car speeding away from 4704 Fairley Drive. The house stood eerily still after that. Inside, 36-year-old Edwina Martin lay bleeding on the floor. A woman who had once built a life filled with family, faith, and ambition was now fighting for every breath. Blood pooled around her, her phone just inches from her hand, its screen glowing with an unfinished 911 call, a call she never got to complete. When police arrived, the scene inside told a story of struggle and desperation. Furniture was overturned, personal belongings scattered across the room. This wasn't a random break-in. This was up close, personal, and intentional. Someone had made sure she wouldn't walk away this time. As paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her, the officers on scene did what they had done before. They started asking questions. Who would want Edwina dead? The answer, though not yet spoken aloud, was already forming in their minds. Because this crime had a haunting similarity to something that had happened 11 years earlier, a night when Edwina had faced death once before. And back then, she had survived. But the man who tried to kill her once was still out there. Long before the bullets of March 27, 2023, there was another night, another crime scene, another attempt to silence Edwina Martin forever. This time it was January 2012. Edwina was 25 years old, a mother of two, trying to rebuild her life. For years, she had been in a volatile relationship with Danny Maurice Brown Jr., the father of her children. But by then, she had finally walked away. In her new chapter, she found love again with a young man named Daniel Hill. At just 22 years old, Hill had no ties to the world of crime. He wasn't part of any street conflicts. He had no enemies. He simply fell in love with a woman who had left the wrong man. That decision would cost him his life. It was a cold January evening at the Valley Crossing Apartments in Little Rock. Edwina and Hill had just arrived at her mother's place. The two had spent the evening talking about their future, making plans for her daughter's birthday. Normal things, happy things. But as soon as they stepped inside, the ambush began. From the darkness, two men emerged, guns raised. Edwina was the first to get hit. A sharp explosion cracked through the air, and she felt a burning pain in her chest. She collapsed onto the floor. Blood spread across her clothes. Hill reacted instantly. He lunged at one of the gunmen, fighting with everything he had. He wrestled one of them into a chokehold, trying to stop the attack. But the other gunman moved in closer. There was no hesitation. A gun was pressed against Hill's head. And then a single shot. Daniel Hill fell to the floor. He had been alive and full of dreams just moments before. Now he was motionless. Edwina, still conscious, crawled toward her mother, seeking protection in her arms. The second gunman wasn't finished. She saw the gun aimed at her. She could hear her mother pleading, "Don't shoot her. Please don't do this." But there was no mercy. The gunman fired again. This time, the bullet struck Edwina's hip. Her 11-year-old nephew, who had been inside the apartment, hid under a bed, watching in horror. He would later tell police he saw Daniel fight to protect them, that he tried to save Edwina's life. The gunmen vanished as quickly as they came. The apartment was filled with silence, except for the cries of Edwina's mother and nephew. Blood stained the floor. A young man was dead. A woman was barely alive. When paramedics arrived, Hill had no pulse. Edwina was still breathing, barely. She was rushed to the hospital, doctors working desperately to keep her alive. She had been shot twice. She had seen the man she loved murdered before her eyes, and she had no doubt who was behind it. The question now was, would she speak up? Because if she did, Danny Brown Jr. would finally face justice. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. When police arrived at the Valley Crossing apartments, they were met with chaos and grief. The lifeless body of 22-year-old Daniel Hill lay on the floor, a bullet wound to the head. Edwina Martin, barely clinging to life, was being rushed to the hospital. Witnesses, shaken and in shock, tried to piece together what had just happened. But one thing was clear. This was not a robbery. This was an execution. As detectives began questioning family members, neighbors, and friends, a single name kept coming up: Danny Maurice Brown Jr. Edwina's family didn't hesitate. They pointed the finger directly at him. They told police about Brown's controlling and violent behavior, about the years of abuse, about the volatile relationship that Edwina had finally escaped. Detectives learned that Edwina and Hill were supposed to meet Brown that night, but instead of a peaceful handoff of their daughter, two gunmen were waiting. Was it a coincidence? Or had Brown set the trap himself? The investigation moved fast. Within weeks, police had their first major lead. An anonymous tip pointed them to two men, Quentin Bernard Boo Jones and Ivor Sean Slick Gordon. Both had violent records, both had ties to Brown. And when detectives dug deeper, they found something chilling.
Please support us by subscribing to this channel. Hit the notification bell icon so you won't miss our latest videos.
Gordon confessed. He told investigators everything. How Brown had put him up to the attack, how he had promised money and a car in exchange for Hill's life. Brown, Gordon said, had given explicit instructions. Hit both of them, blow the bitch's head off, but don't hurt the kids. Gordon admitted that this wasn't even the first attempt, that Brown had tried to have Edwina killed a week earlier, but the plan failed. This time he doubled down. And the payment for murder? $500 up front, another $220 after, and a used SUV. Armed with Gordon's confession, police moved in on Brown. When officers called him to inform him that Edwina had been shot, his response raised red flags. Brown claimed he was at home eating pizza with his kids at the time of the shooting. He insisted he had nothing to do with it. But investigators weren't buying it. Within 2 weeks, police issued an arrest warrant for Danny Brown Jr., charging him with capital murder and attempted capital murder. This should have been the moment that justice was served. The evidence was strong, the confession was damning, the motive was obvious. But then, something no one expected happened. Edwina Martin, who had survived the bullets meant to kill her, chose to do the unthinkable. And with that decision, the entire case fell apart. Well, weeks. That's how long it took for Edwina Martin to do the unthinkable. 2 weeks after surviving a murder-for-hire plot, after watching Daniel Hill die in front of her, after fighting for her life in a hospital bed, Edwina made a choice that would leave her family, her friends, and even investigators speechless. She married the man accused of trying to kill her. There was no grand ceremony, no celebrations, no white dress. Just a quiet courthouse wedding, no fanfare, no family, no friends. The woman, who had barely escaped death, now stood in front of a minister, saying, "I do," to the man she knew had tried to have her murdered. To the outside world, this decision was incomprehensible. Why would she bind herself legally to the man who wanted her dead? Why would she protect him instead of helping put him behind bars? The detectives working the case were stunned. To them, this wasn't just a woman making a reckless choice. This was the key witness in a murder trial suddenly refusing to cooperate. Prosecutors had a strong case against Danny Brown Jr. They had Gordon's confession detailing how Brown planned the attack, phone records linking Brown to the hitmen, the financial trail, evidence that Brown had paid for the killing, motive Brown's violent history with Edwina and his jealousy over her new relationship. But none of it mattered, because their star witness, Edwina Martin, was now Brown's wife. And with that one legal decision, everything changed. As Brown's wife, she could legally refuse to testify against him. And she did. Over the next few months, prosecutors watched as Edwina's cooperation turned to hostility. She became increasingly antagonistic toward the investigation. Statements she had previously made became vague, inconsistent. The woman who had once identified her attacker without hesitation now seemed uncertain, confused. Then there were the jail phone calls. While Brown sat in custody, awaiting trial, prosecutors obtained recordings of phone calls between him and Edwina. In those calls, she made it very clear she had no intention of testifying. With no testimony from Edwina, the case crumbled. In August 2012, 8 months after the attack, the prosecution made a stunning announcement. They were dropping all charges against Danny Brown Jr. And just like that, the man accused of hiring hitmen to kill her walked free. From that moment on, the story changed. On paper, Brown and Edwina were a loving couple. They raised their children together. They ran a business. They posted family photos, vacations, and happy moments online. But those who knew Edwina saw something different. Her once vibrant personality began to fade. She stopped confiding in close friends. She distanced herself from the people who once tried to protect her. Her boutique, bodacious beauty was thriving, but Brown had inserted himself into its operations. Friends whispered about how controlling he had become. Still, to the outside world, Edwina looked happy. But was she? For 11 years, she lived under the same roof as the man who had once ordered her execution. And the world wouldn't know the answer to that question until it was too late. With the case against Danny Brown Jr. dropped, the story took a turn no one saw coming. Instead of standing across from him in a courtroom, Edwina Martin stood beside him in life, as his wife. To the outside world, their marriage was a second chance, a story of redemption. They raised their 2 children together, they built a business, attended church, posted family photos online, all the markers of a normal, loving relationship. But those closest to Edwina saw something else. Her social circle, once full of friends and family, slowly shrank. The woman who had survived a violent ambush, who had built a life for herself after escaping Brown once before, seemed to disappear into the background of her own story. Was she truly happy? Or was she simply playing the role expected of her? For years, those closest to Edwina noticed small but telling signs. She stopped confiding in people. The friends who once knew everything about her life now knew nothing. She spoke less and less about her marriage. Her presence online changed. In the past, Edwina loved to share personal reflections, thoughts, and happy moments. But as the years passed, her posts became more scripted, less personal, more focused on appearances. She avoided certain topics. Whenever anyone brought up the past, the attack, Daniel Hill, her marriage to Brown, she quickly changed the subject. Her business was no longer her own. Bodacious beauty, her boutique, had been her passion, but as it grew, Brown became more involved. He inserted himself into financial decisions, took control of certain aspects, made sure nothing happened without his approval. There were whispers. Neighbors heard the arguments. Friends saw the subtle control. Family members worried, but Edwina never admitted anything was wrong. And that's what made it so hard to intervene. She was successful. She had a thriving business. She coached a dance team. She worked at Blue Cross Blue Shield. By all appearances, she had everything under control. But was she really free? For 11 years, she lived under the same roof as the man she once knew had tried to have her murdered. How do you live every day with that knowledge? How do you sleep beside someone whose name was once on an arrest warrant for your attempted murder? Maybe Edwina believed she could manage the situation. Maybe she thought if she played the role of the devoted wife, it would keep her safe. Maybe she thought that if she never stepped out of line, she could avoid waking up in another hospital bed or worse. But by 2023, something changed. And when Edwina started making moves to free herself, it set off a deadly chain of events. For 11 years, Edwina Martin played her role. She was the business owner, the devoted mother, the supportive wife. To anyone looking in from the outside, she had done what many wouldn't dare. She had forgiven. But in early 2023, something changed. People close to her noticed small but undeniable shifts in her behavior. She wasn't the same woman she had been a year before, or 5 years before, or 10 years before, and Danny Brown Jr. knew it. She stopped posting about Brown. For years, their social media showed a carefully curated image of their marriage, family photos, church events, date nights. But in early 2023, she stopped mentioning him at all. She deleted photos, removed his name from captions, and stopped tagging him. She started putting money aside. One day, Brown received a notification on his phone, an alert from their shared phone plan. Edwina had opened a new bank account. He noticed. She spoke in hushed tones. At dance practice, where she coached her daughter's team, a fellow coach overheard Edwina on the phone. She wasn't talking about dance routines. She was talking about safety plans, about custody arrangements, about getting away. She moved important documents out of the house. She called her mother and asked if she could store something at her house: birth certificates, financial paperwork, medical records. Her mother didn't press for details. She didn't have to. By late March 2023, Brown was watching her more closely. He had always been possessive, but this was different. Neighbors noticed his car parked outside at odd hours. He was circling the block more often, coming home at times when Edwina wouldn't expect him. She had always known how to navigate his moods, how to keep the peace when things felt volatile. But now, something was different. She wasn't playing along anymore. She had started making moves as if she was planning for a life without him. In the last few weeks of her life, Edwina had one last conversation with her sister. She asked a question that still haunts her family to this day. "If anything ever happens to me, can you take care of the kids?" Her sister reassured her, probably not realizing at the time just how serious the question was. Because less than a week later, Edwina Martin would be dead, and Danny Brown Jr. would disappear. March 27, 2023 was a Monday like any other. At least that's how it seemed. Edwina Martin woke up, got dressed, and went to work at Blue Cross Blue Shield, just as she had done for years. She handled customer calls, chatted with coworkers, and laughed at a joke over lunch. But what no one knew was that this would be the last normal day of her life. At exactly 3:30 p.m., Edwina walked out of her office building just as security cameras captured her final moments outside of work. She sent one last text to her daughter. "What do you want for dinner, baby?" It was a small, everyday message, but it would be the last text she would ever send. At 3:57 p.m., a neighbor on Fairley Drive heard the first gunshot. Then another, then silence. Minutes later, a car sped away from the scene. Inside the house, Edwina lay on the floor, struggling to breathe. She had been shot multiple times. Her phone was just inches away from her fingertips, the screen still glowing. She had tried to call for help. She never finished dialing. The first officers arrived within 5 minutes of the 911 calls from neighbors. The front door was unlocked. Inside, signs of a struggle. Furniture overturned. A shattered glass near the kitchen counter. Blood trailing across the living room floor. And in the center of it all, Edwina Martin, gasping for air. Paramedics worked desperately to stabilize her, but her injuries were severe. At 5:17 p.m., doctors at the University of Arkansas Medical Science Center pronounced her dead. The woman who had once survived an assassination attempt had now been silenced forever. The moment detectives assessed the scene, one name came to mind. One person had the motive. One person had the history. One person had the reason to keep Edwina from walking away. Danny Maurice Brown Jr. But there was just one problem. He was gone. By the time police arrived at 4704 Fairley Drive, the man they wanted was already gone. No signs of forced entry. No signs of a break-in. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was deliberate, planned, personal. And now the suspect had vanished. When officers checked Brown's usual hangouts, he was nowhere to be found. His car, missing. His phone, turned off. His home, abandoned. The detectives pulled surveillance footage from the neighborhood security cameras. And there it was. At 4:02 p.m., just minutes after the shooting, a car was caught racing out of the neighborhood. The car belonged to Danny Brown Jr. For 3 weeks, Brown stayed one step ahead of law enforcement. He was spotted in different states, moving from motel to motel. He switched cars, changed his appearance, avoided using credit cards. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states were searching for him, and yet he remained out of reach. But one mistake would cost him his freedom. A tip came in. A cheap motel just outside Memphis, Tennessee. U.S. Marshals moved in. When they entered the room, Brown didn't fight. No dramatic chase, no standoff, no last attempt to escape. Just a duffel bag packed with clothes, a fake ID, and over $3,000 in cash. This was a man who had planned to run for as long as he could. But the chase was over. Brown was brought back to Little Rock, Arkansas, and formally charged with capital murder. This time there would be no loopholes. No dropped charges. No second chances. This time, justice was coming. Danny Brown Jr. had escaped justice once before. In 2012, prosecutors had built a strong case against him. Motive, witness testimony, and a confession from one of the hitmen. But the moment Edwina Martin married him and refused to testify, the case fell apart. This time, things were different. There was no Edwina to change her mind. She had been murdered in her own home, and this time, the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors wasted no time. They charged Danny Brown Jr. with capital murder, felon in possession of a firearm, tampering with evidence, fleeing justice. This time there would be no plea deal, no loopholes, no technicalities. This time he was facing a possible death sentence. The prosecution laid out their case in chilling detail. Security footage, Brown's car fleeing the scene just minutes after the gunshots. The murder weapon, found inside his abandoned vehicle covered in Edwina's blood. Text messages, Edwina had been making plans to separate from Brown, something he would never allow. The 911 call, Edwina tried to call for help but never finished dialing. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was planned, calculated, inevitable. Brown's lawyers argued self-defense, claiming that he and Edwina had an argument that turned violent. But the evidence told a different story. Edwina had been shot multiple times, not in the middle of a struggle, but execution style. She had tried to call for help, not attack him. The jury didn't believe a word of it. It took them less than 2 hours to decide. On June 14, 2023, the verdict was read. Found guilty on all charges. Brown sat motionless, showing no emotion. A man who had spent years manipulating, controlling, and escaping consequences had finally run out of time. At his sentencing, prosecutors pushed for the death penalty. They argued that Brown had shown no remorse, that he had been given a second chance in 2012 and used it to finish what he started. The judge agreed. Danny Brown Jr. was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Edwina's family, justice had finally come, but it had come too late. A woman who had once survived the unthinkable was gone forever. And the question that lingered in everyone's mind was simple. Could this have been prevented? Edwina Martin's story did not end in a courtroom. Her life, her choices, her struggles, her tragic death left behind a legacy that could not be ignored. For those who loved her, the grief was unimaginable. Her 2 children, Danielle III and Danielle, had lost their mother in the most violent way possible. They were left to grow up in the shadow of a tragedy that never should have happened. Her mother, Betty Jean Martin, had begged for her daughter's life once before, on the night Edwina was first shot in 2012. That night, her pleas had gone unheard. 11 years later, she buried her child. But from that grief came action. In Little Rock, Arkansas, Edwina's name became more than just a headline. Her dance students, the young girls she had coached, mentored, and loved like her own, dedicated their next competition performance in her honor. They wore purple ribbons, the color of domestic violence awareness, a silent message to every woman who had ever felt trapped, controlled, or afraid. Bodacious Beauty, the boutique Edwina had built from the ground up, became something more. Her family transformed it into a memorial foundation, using its platform to support women escaping abusive relationships, the kind of support Edwina never had when she needed it most. Her co-workers at Blue Cross Blue Shield created a scholarship fund for children affected by domestic violence. They called it Edwina's Light. Her story, her suffering, and her ultimate fate sparked a conversation that could no longer be ignored. Edwina Martin's death left unanswered questions that still haunt those who knew her. Why did she go back? Why did she marry the man who tried to kill her? Why did the justice system fail her once before? And could she have been saved? For every person who read her story, heard her name, or saw her face on the news, those questions did not fade away. Because the truth is, Edwina's story is not unique. Thousands of women, smart, successful, loving mothers just like her, are caught in cycles of abuse, manipulation, and fear. Some make it out. Some don't. And some, like Edwina, almost escape, only to be pulled back in one final time. Her story is a reminder that domestic violence is not just physical. It is psychological, emotional, and financial. It is slow, suffocating, and often invisible, until it's too late. If Edwina's story teaches us anything, it's this. Leaving an abuser is not as simple as walking away. Abusers do not stop just because a victim survives. And if we ignore the warning signs, we risk burying the people we love. Her name is more than just another case file. It is a warning. It is a wake-up call. And for those who are listening, it is a chance to break the cycle before another life is lost. Edwina Martin's story is not just about one woman's tragic fate. It is about the silent battles fought behind closed doors. It is about the people who never escape. It is about the ones who do, only to be pulled back into a deadly embrace. Her life was stolen in a way that should have never happened. She survived the first attempt. She fought to rebuild herself. And when she finally tried to leave for good, the person who had always controlled her made sure she never got the chance. But here's the question that should haunt all of us. How many other Edwinas are out there right now, trapped, afraid, and waiting for a moment of escape that may never come? What can we do? If you or someone you know is in a dangerous relationship, don't wait. Get help. You know the signs of control, manipulation, and abuse. They are not always physical. Remember that leaving an abuser is the most dangerous time for a victim, and that's when support matters most. In the description below, we have included resources and hotline numbers for those in unsafe situations. If you need help, please reach out. Your voice matters. This story needs to be heard, not just for Edwina, but for every person trapped in a cycle of abuse. If this video resonated with you, help us spread awareness. Like this video to push it into the algorithm so more people see it. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Comment below if you've ever known someone in a similar situation. Your experience might help someone else recognize the warning signs. Subscribe for more investigations into cases that don't just shock us, but force us to ask the hard questions. Because domestic violence thrives in silence. And the more we talk about it, the more lives we can save.